let's have a look at this new online tool. So the iSoQ tool, it's a free online software developed from the GRADE CERQual project group in collaboration with the Epistemonicus Foundation. And it's really in the category of a data management tool. It doesn't do your GRADE CERQual assessments for you, but it helps you manage all the information you're going to need to consider to make those GRADE CERQual assessments and sort of, facilitate the process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move between the slides and the iSoQ tool, okay, to give you, to show you what it actually looks like when you're applying GRADE CERQual. So let's just look a little bit more in detail at each of these components, okay? So just to give you the definition of methodological limitations, it's the extent to which there are problems in the design or conduct of the primary studies supporting a review finding, okay? Concerns about methodological limitations. So we are less confident that the review finding reflects the phenomenon of interest when the primary studies underlying a review finding are shown to have problems in the way they were designed or conducted. So to be able to assess the methodological limitations component, review authors will have had to have applied a critical appraisal tool for qualitative studies to each of their included studies. This is a precursor to applying GRADE CERQual. Typically, such tools would include questions around participants and settings, how data was collected and analyzed, researcher reflexivity, etc. And I encourage you to go watch the session in this series, particularly on this topic. You can also have a look. At the moment, we don't, as GRADE CERQual, we don't tell review authors what critical appraisal tool they need to use. So it's up to the review team. But you can have a look at some of these publications, Muntkas and Noyes et al. 2017, for some tips on kind of what to look for in a critical appraisal tool when you're planning to apply GRADE CERQual. So grounds for concern for methodological limitations. So when you've identified some methodological limitations in those studies supporting a review finding, you need to ask yourself, is this particular limitation likely to have had a serious impact on the review findings? Because some limitations may be more serious than others, and other limitations may be more serious for some review findings, but not for others. So it's really, it's always really important to remember that we're assessing the review finding here, okay? And what is the relative contribution of the studies to the review finding? If there are some methodological limitations in some of the key studies that support that review finding, this is more of a concern, okay, than if those studies are not particularly key to supporting that review finding. So let's see what that looks like when you work in iSoQ, okay? Oops. It's going to come here. Okay, so let me just show you here. This is the iSoQ homepage. Okay, I've already logged in here, so I'm going to go to my workspace. And I'm going to open this template. This is an example project that we use in our GRADE CERQual training. Okay, so this example project is around childhood vaccination. And you'll see in the way the iSoQ tool is set up is that once you've created a new project, okay, I'll come back here just to show you that. Here are my projects. I can share them with my fellow reviewers, okay, with my review team. I can invite them to the project. I can give them access to read or just read and edit the project. So you can work as a team with some limitations. It doesn't allow for you to work live and simultaneously on exactly the same thing at the same time within the program. So you do have to kind of communicate outside, you know, who's working on what, when. Otherwise, there is a small risk that you could accidentally, if you're saving it at the same time, one person, oversave over the other person's work. But it definitely allows for group collaboration, which is really important when it comes to GRADE CERQual. So let's have a look here. The first page that you see when you create a new project is this My Data page, and there's 4 steps here. And this is encouraging review authors to bring in the data that they're going to need to apply GRADE CERQual. Okay, so these are all things that you're already producing as part of your review. But if you know in advance that you're going to apply GRADE CERQual, you can already be preparing that data in a way that's compatible with the iSoQ software. So one is to upload the references for your included studies. Okay, so here I have my 11 studies. Okay. Secondly is to bring in your inclusion and exclusion criteria for the review. Thirdly is to bring in or create your characteristics of studies tables. So these are the sort of descriptive elements of the study. For example, the question, the intervention, the study setting, study participants, etc. You can either create the table directly in iSoQ and then export it later if you wanted to, for example, export it to Excel, or you can import the table, but you have to use the template that we provide for the import to be successful. Okay, and then step 4, same thing, but it's your methodological assessments table. Okay, so you can create it in iSoQ or you can import it using our template. So once you've brought in all of this sort of background data, you're ready to carry on to the interactive summary of qualitative findings. And so here is the table that you're building, right, as the review team. So you would add a review finding, a summarized review finding to the table. You would associate it to its supporting references. And once you do so, you can complete the GRADE CERQual assessment. So as GRADE CERQual is applied to individual review findings, iSoQ prepares for you a worksheet for each individual review finding. Okay, and this is where all the work that you've put into bringing in all your tables and your inclusion, exclusion criteria, etc., really pays off, because what this worksheet does is it extracts the information that you need for those studies that support this one review finding. Okay, so because I said, okay, this review finding is supported by these 6 studies, now the worksheet has extracted the information for these 6 studies, okay, from what I imported in the My Data section. It's also at this stage that I bring in any extracted data. So your extracted data could be sitting in an in vivo project or in Excel, wherever it was that you were doing your data extraction and then analysis and synthesis, you would bring in at this stage your extracted data. And then you have everything kind of under one roof. So let's go for methodological limitations, okay? The one I just presented on the first component. So iSoQ shows you on the left-hand side the sort of prompting questions. So do you have any concerns about the methodological quality of contributing studies as a whole that could lower your confidence in the review finding? Then you have to basically consider the information to make that assessment. And that's what we display for you on the right-hand side here. So here's your methodological assessments table, and presented are the assessments for those 6 studies that support this one review finding, okay? And we show you the review finding, and we also show you the extracted data. Why? Because it's important to consider these particular limitations where you've noted limitations in relation to the specific review finding, because some limitations might not be as concerning depending on the review finding, and also the extracted data, because perhaps if there are limitations in key studies that are really providing important data for that finding, that's more concerning. Okay. So that's why we display these 3 things here. So you'd be looking across your tables, looking for those no's or unclears or whatever it is the language that your appraisal tool uses. Importantly, though, you can see, as we see here, that whenever you note a methodological limitation when you're doing your critical appraisals, it's really key, really important to say more than just yes or no or can't tell, because you need that detail. You need to understand why you said no or why you said can't tell, because that's the detail that you're going to be considering when applying GRADE CERQual. So then I would make a selection. So for example, just choosing anyone here, minor concerns. I can keep note of the concerns that I was seeing in this notes box. And then I'm prompted to add an explanation. Okay, and that's a requirement to the GRADE CERQual approach. An assessment needs to be accompanied by an explanation. Okay, so let's go back to the slides and have a look at the next one here. Okay, so coherence. Coherence is an assessment of how clear and cogent the fit is between the data from the primary studies and the review finding. We are less confident that the finding reflects the phenomenon of interest when the fit between the data from the primary studies and the review finding is not completely clear. So here we're talking about that review finding as we've written it and the findings from the contributing study. And this comes back to the question we had earlier. So how do you deal with variation or ambiguity in the data with findings that might be written in quite different ways, right? So here's an example of kind of the same finding being written in two different styles, two different ways. So option one, we've got a finding, this is, imagine a review about children in care homes. Okay, so most children preferred staff to have week-long shifts because they liked the stability and structure and the opportunity to form attachment. Children in one study preferred short shifts, but these children had poor relationships with their caregivers. And in another study, the experiences of the children were unclear. So this review finding explicitly details, the variation in the data, okay, and actually explicitly names those studies that had a different pattern, okay. So we would assess this as having no concerns about coherence because that reflects the underlying data very, very clearly. But we may write the finding in a different way. We might write the finding as in option two. So in situations where children have good relations with their caregivers, they prefer longer shifts because these provide stability and structure and opportunities to form attachment. So in this case, we might, reflect that we have minor concerns about coherence because yes, the finding is broadly supported by the data, but there's a study that gave contradictory information, a contradictory view or account of children's experiences. And in one study, it wasn't clear, but the review finding doesn't explicitly detail all of that variation. So we would be transparent about that by saying we have minor concerns about coherence. Okay, and the type, how you write your review findings will depend on your review question, on the method, on the purpose of your review, on the audience of the review. Okay, so let's have a look at that in iSoQ. Okay, so here coherence, moving on to the next component. We have on the left-hand side the prompt. Do you have any concerns about the coherence between the review finding and the underlying data that could lower your confidence in the review finding? Okay, and so again, our guidance here is that you may have concerns if some of the data from included studies contradict the review finding, if it's not clear if some of the underlying data support the review finding, or if there's plausible alternative descriptions or interpretations or explanations. So that's why on the right-hand side, what we're displaying for the review team to consider is the review finding and the extracted data from the 6 studies that support the review finding. And if you note any exceptions in the data or contradictions or, certain data aspects that are not, it's not clear whether it fully supports the review finding as we've written it, you could make note of those. And then as a review team, you have to come to a decision whether what your level of concern is. So based on those concerns identified, would you say you have no or very minor concerns, moderate concerns, or serious concerns? And again, you make a selection and you'll be prompted to add the explanation. Okay, we'll come back here. Okay. Just to add a little bit more about coherence, in the case of coherence, an important possible first step is to consider whether your review finding that you're assessing is more descriptive or more interpretive. If it's a more descriptive review finding, the concerns might be around variation in the data. So there's some elements of the underlying body of evidence that don't fit the description of the key patterns or ambiguous data. and that this varied or ambiguous data must either be reflected in the review finding or discussed and represented in the assessment of coherence. If your review finding is more interpretive or explanatory, the concerns around coherence might be thinking about whether there are plausible alternative descriptions, interpretations, or explanations that could have been used to synthesize that data. Okay, let's go on to the adequacy component. So the degree of richness and quantity of data supporting a review finding. And here, the idea is that we are less confident that the finding reflects the phenomenon of interest when the underlying data are not sufficiently rich or only come from a small number of studies or participants. And again, it's the review authors that need to make a judgment on what constitutes data that are not or are sufficiently rich or too small in number. Okay, in the context of a specific review finding. Your grounds for concern around adequacy, maybe if there's insufficient detail to gain an understanding of the phenomenon described in the review finding, or if the review finding is supported by data from only one or very few studies, participants, or observations. But you're thinking of that always in relation to the review findings. So review findings that are simpler or primarily descriptive, you may be very satisfied with relatively superficial data. Okay, that the superficial data is sufficient for supporting that kind of review finding, and you may not have expressed concerns around adequacy. If you have review findings that are complex or explanatory, you may have concerns if the finding is based on data that is too superficial to allow a sufficient exploration of the phenomenon. So again, it is a considered reflection here on the balance between quantity and richness and in relation to that review finding. Okay, and let's have a look at that now in iSoQ. Okay, so again, on the left, do you have any concerns about the adequacy of the data supporting the review finding that could lower your confidence in the review findings? So on the right-hand side, we show you the extracted data, which is where you would be looking to make an assessment of how rich the data is that supports this individual review finding. And the characteristics of studies table shows you very quickly, well, how many studies are supporting this review finding, but also perhaps how many participants or how many encounters did the researcher have with the participants to gain to reach their conclusions and interpretations of the data. And of course, as always, your review finding. So again, you make your selection, you add your explanation, and it gets added to the table once you click save. Okay, and then I'm going to come back here to my presentation, and we've got relevance, the extent to which the body of evidence from the primary study supporting a review finding is applicable to the context specified in the review question. So in this component, we're looking at the contexts specified in the supporting studies in relation to the review question. We are less confident that the finding reflects the phenomenon of interest when the contexts of the primary studies underlying a review finding are substantively different from the context of the review question. And what do we mean by context? So that could be things like time, where the study is conducted too long ago to be relevant, the setting, is the setting in our review question match the settings of the primary studies that underlie that review finding, the treatment or the phenomenon of interest or the intervention, or the perspective, for example. Grounds for concern around relevance could be, like already mentioned, indirect, okay, indirect relevance, partial relevance, or unclear relevance. If we look here at iSoQ, it should become clear why it is we're showing you what we're showing you on the right-hand side, okay? So you're thinking about the relevance of the underlying studies to your review question. So we show you, of course, the review question, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, because this often gives you some more detail on those contexts, that phenomenon of interest, the time, the perspective that we're interested in the review. And looking at this in relation to those supporting studies, how do they compare? What are these supporting studies really looking at? Whose perspectives are they investigating, etc.? And you would always be thinking about that in relation to the review finding and noting any concerns you see and deciding what level of concerns those are and adding an explanation. So once you've got all 4 done, and I'm just going to show you a completed project just so it's clearer. So let's say here, okay, we've got our 4 components assessed, then the overall assessment of confidence becomes available. And when you click on that, what you're shown is the assessments you made for each of those individual components and your review finding. And it's here that you need to decide whether any of the concerns you identified or a combination of these concerns lower your confidence in the review finding. So you start off with the assumption that it's high confidence, and based on these concerns and your judgment of these, whether you would downgrade the confidence to moderate, low, or very low. And if you make a selection, iSoQ will provide you with a minimum explanation. An explanation is required. This minimum explanation just sort of summarizes the level of concern by component. But we also encourage review authors to add detail for the specific components that were really driving down, the assessment. So to be, even more transparent if possible with some added detail. Okay. And once you have completed, let's say we make a selection here. Okay. Then your assessment for this one finding has been added to your iSoQ table. Okay. And once, let's say you've had lots of findings in here and you're finished, you can publish your iSoQ to a database, an open access kind of database of iSoQ tables, which we're hoping this website will become. And you can print and export your tables into Word or PDFs to include in your publications or reports. Okay. So, yeah, with that said, I just want to let you know that there's some additional support out there for you. So if you're applying GRADE CERQual, check out our Q&A webinars on our website, cerqual.org. We also have iSoQ drop-in support webinars. There's lots of help videos on the iSoQ site, and also some tech support by just emailing us. And coming soon, keep your eyes peeled for an evaluation of GRADE CERQual's use in evidence synthesis. This evaluation focuses on fidelity and reporting. It's currently under review, and it'll be a really helpful resource for review authors. And I welcome you to also come to a longer demonstration of the iSoQ tool on May 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. This webinar is hosted by PAHO and EvidNet Americas, and will also be provided in Spanish and Portuguese.